Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Cindy Bloom. It is the week of May 12th, and this is your Monday briefing. Draft tax legislation is on the move, and here to talk about what it means for business are Andrew Pryor and Pat Brown. Andrew, Pat, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Great to be here, Cindy.
So this first question is for both of you. And Andrew, let me start with you. So we had a chairman's mark come out on Friday, and we are anticipating much more activity this week. So could you talk about that, first of all, and what it all means, and get into some of the provisions?
Absolutely. So just at a high level, the three remaining House committees with reconciliation instructions are going to be marking up tomorrow. That's the House Ways and Means Committee, which is responsible for the tax portion of the reconciliation bill, Energy and Commerce, which is responsible for the bulk of the mandatory savings through Medicaid and other changes, and also the Agriculture Committee, which has a pretty substantial savings number as well. The House Ways and Means Committee is going to be writing to a $4 trillion net tax cut number because the House Republican leadership recognizes they're not going to be able to achieve $2 trillion in savings. So instead of $4.5 trillion net tax cut, it's $4 trillion. So with that in mind, what came out at the end of last week was a bill that cost $5 trillion over 10 years and is primarily focused on extending the TCJA provisions that are due to sunset or change at the end of 2025 on a permanent basis. One thing missing from that bill is a salt cap fix. They're still working on that. Meetings going on even today to try to resolve that. So that's a work in progress. Depending on what they do, that could mitigate some of the $5 trillion cost. But what we're really waiting to see is this amendment in the nature of a substitute that'll be out later today, which I would describe as the real tax bill. I think we're expecting a substantial rewrite of the chairman's mark that came out on Friday, both to add in offsets that would bring down that revenue cost, but also adding in some of the business tax relief provisions that many companies will care about, both domestic and international.
Pat, could you get into some of the provisions as well?
Well, look, in terms of what was actually in the text that was released on Friday, it was only good news from the standpoint of corporate taxpayers, but there wasn't a lot of news in the sense that there really wasn't a lot there, right? There was a very short, as Andrew noted, really kind of a placeholder document that was released by Chairman Smith. So what was there was good news, which is the extension on a permanent basis of the rates and the computational methodologies for each of the three foundational elements of the international provisions from TCJA. So the GILTI provisions, the FDII provisions, and the BEAT provisions. So they didn't get any worse in the document that was released on Friday. And the current rates, which were scheduled to go up next year, of course, were extended at their current levels on a permanent basis. That's good news. But obviously what's to come is incredibly important, as Andrew already alluded to. And what's to come, of course, is, well, what changes will there be in particular to these international provisions? And as we think about those international provisions, we know that as a typical matter of practice, Congress doesn't look to the international provisions as a place to spend money on a net basis. In other words, if there are improvements from the standpoint of taxpayers to the international provisions, we should expect to see offsets. We should expect to see pay-fors in some form for some or all of those improvements. And so, again, the question becomes, well, what might we see? So we've heard the administration talk about, and we've heard rumors floating around Capitol Hill about potential improvements to the FDII regime. Well, what might those look like? We'll obviously be looking with anticipation when we see the chairman's the revised document come out in all likelihood later today. So that's one of the key areas we'll be looking at. Of course, we know that since the TCJA was enacted, the application of the GILTI provisions has been a source of a lot of concern on the part of taxpayers, in part because for a lot of companies that have high tax foreign earnings, they still end up owing residual U.S. tax under the GILTI regime because of the impact of expense allocation. I'm not going to torture everybody with all the details of all of that stuff, but that's certainly something that we know companies have been talking to members of Congress on Capitol Hill about for a number of years. So we'll be looking when this revised document comes out to see if there's anything done in that space. And then with respect to the BEAT, the other foundational element, international element from the TCJA, again, we know that there are aspects of the BEATS operation that frankly don't really make a lot of sense, don't line up very well with what the BEAT was intended to do if you read the legislative history to the BEAT. And so on each of those three elements, we'll be looking to see what sort of changes might there be. No changes from in the text that was released on Friday, just a continuation of the current rate and computation structure. But in each of these three areas, we'll be looking for potential changes. And then frankly, Sindhu, the big question overhanging all of this stuff are things like, well, what about pay-fors in the corporate sector? So increasing the excise tax on stock buybacks, restricting further the deductibility of executive compensation under Section 162M. These are things that have been floated around. Will they be in this revised document that we see possibly later today or not? So there's going to be a lot to read through and sift through when this revised document comes out, and a lot that we will be looking for. To be sure, looking at what was in Friday's document, what further refinements might be made to those international provisions, but well beyond that as well, how will Chairman Smith and congressional Republicans be looking to try and find some pay-fors potentially in the corporate sector, and how should we be interpreting those?
Thanks for that. And I think, yes, it is going to be torture to get into all the details, but we will be getting into all the details. So, Pat, where does Pillar 2 play in all this?
Yeah, so great question, Sindhu. So I think with respect to Pillar 2, obviously the Treasury Department is right now in the process of discussing with other countries what changes the United States will need to see to the Pillar 2 framework. But that happens against the backdrop, of course, as you note, of this reconciliation bill and the potential for additional provisions in the reconciliation bill, including possibly this Section 899, which was reproposed by Chairman Smith several weeks ago. Section 899, of course, would impose forms of retaliatory taxation on other countries if they adopted forms of extraterritorial or discriminatory taxation measures, as described in Section 899. Now, extraterritorial taxation measures, as described in that bill, is clearly focused on the UTPR. So one of the huge questions overhanging all of this stuff is, will Section 899 or some other form of legislation that is directed at essentially buttressing the administration and the Congress's position about the U.S.'s views on Pillar 2, will something like that find its way into the reconciliation bill? And our first big, peek into whether or not that will be the case will be this revised text that we see possibly later today. Will, in fact, the Ways and Means Committee plant a flag to say, we're serious about retaliating against other countries unless we see the kinds of changes we need to see on Pillar 2, and Section 899 or possibly some other provision could find its way into the text that we see later.
So, Andrew, could you address timing, the impact on timing, and what we can see in terms of action in the Senate?
Absolutely. And just to kind of maybe start with that amendment in the nature of a substitute that Pat was talking about, that's due out later today, as Pat mentioned. And I would just add that, that's where we're going to see some of Trump's individual tax relief priorities also layered in. I think 174 R&D expensing, the 163J EBITDA base limitation, and 100% bonus will also be addressed. And we're going to want to look at the details of that. But recognizing that they're already at $5 trillion and they only have a $4 trillion number to work with, we're going to have to see how they shoehorn that in. Revenue raisers are obviously one way to get there, but also I think they might play around with the duration of permanency versus short-term temporary tax relief provisions to make the numbers work. So when that comes out, that's going to be the starting point. As I mentioned, substantial rewrite. We could see further revisions when they actually hold the markup on Tuesday afternoon. Expect that to be a multi-day affair at least, or at least late into the evening. And then we get to, once, assuming that the Ways and Means Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the Ag Committee all report out their bills this week, then the budget reconciliation bill would be stitched together by the House Budget Committee as soon as this Friday, with the anticipation that they go to the House floor the week of May 19th, next week, with a view towards passing the House version of budget reconciliation, the one big beautiful bill, before Congress goes out for the Memorial Day recess. Assuming that they stick to that timetable, then when they come back from the recess period, the Senate would take up budget reconciliation of its own, responding to what the House sent over, and they'll work their changes. How quickly that happens remains to be seen, but there is this notion, at least from House Republican leaders and the administration, that perhaps they could get done by the end of June before the 4th of July recess. That may be an aggressive timeline to hold to, but Secretary Bessent has certainly said that that's his goal. One notable thing was the Treasury did release its debt limit X date, which says that, consistent with what we've heard before, that the debt limit probably won't be reached, or default won't occur until August recess. So they do have potentially until the end of July, and I think Secretary Bessent has said at a minimum we should get this done by mid-July. I think maybe end of July more realistic, but that's probably the timeline. And so I think the ultimate deadline, because of the debt limit being addressed in reconciliation, is if they don't get it done by the end of June, they certainly probably have to get it done by the end of July.
All right, thank you for that. And Pat, let me come back to you. So for us, this is the hottest game in town, right? The tax bill, but there are other things going on. So how does this complicate or get in the way of or intersect with other things that are happening, such as a tariff response?
Yeah, much less important things, to be clear, Sindhu. But the tariff response is obviously something that people who don't have the privilege in working in tax every day might be thinking about. So look, we saw some very favorable announcements coming from the administration earlier today with respect to at least a temporary reprieve and significant progress in trade talks with China. And, in terms of how that layers into the legislative process, there's always been a little bit of, I'll call it confusion, but I think there's been sort of inconsistent messaging, depending on who you talk to in the Republican camp, about the impact of tariffs. Were they intended to be a revenue source, in which case the expectation would have to be that they would be there for a longer duration, or are they a negotiating tactic? Obviously, to the extent they're a revenue source, at least some people were pointing to the tariffs as, well, this takes some of the pressure off of the monetary exercise that we have to go through in reconciliation, at least from a political standpoint. Maybe it doesn't change the actual math and the congressional rules that have to be accommodated, but maybe it changes the political dynamics there if you can view tariffs as a revenue source. On the other hand, if you view tariffs as a negotiating tactic, then you're trying to get to better trade deals, and that's a very positive thing for the United States, presumably. But it would also suggest that the revenue from the tariffs isn't necessarily something that you would look at over the longer term. And so there's always been some degree of inconsistency in terms of the messaging around that point. I think the developments earlier today, while very positive, certainly suggest that the much of the tariffs should be seen through the lens of a mechanism for negotiating better trade arrangements with other countries. So you could look at that and say, well, does that put more pressure on the budget reconciliation exercise? Maybe. Although honestly, Cindy, I think a lot more of this has to do with the fact that the administration has sort of a significant win, maybe some wind at its backs as it enters into a really critical work period in the Congress for the reconciliation bill. So getting some positive developments just at the real start of these critical markups this week, I think is a positive thing overall. How long it lasts, what else might interfere with that messaging, obviously we'll all have to watch and learn together.
Pat, Andrew, thank you so much. This has really been great. I know it's going to be a busy week, so I appreciate you taking the time to talk about this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Stay with Policy on Demand for the latest on tax legislation this week. Included in the description of this episode are the latest Week in Review with Chairman Camp, as well as a link to register for an upcoming webcast on Pillar 2 challenges. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. Take care.